Precisely 7 days ago, we talked about the situation in the raid. So, it's been another week, and more importantly, we are now talking about what the meta looks like in the raid in terms of performance of tanks, and actually no, nobody cares about tanks, healers and DPS, with a window towards the very incoming balance tuning that will land this reset. So we don't just get to look at how specs are performing now, but also we get to put an asterisk, the asterisk for the expected performance change in just a few days. For both the specs being buffed, so we are talking about Frost Death Knight, we are talking about Balance Druid, we are talking about Devastation Evoker as well as Preservation Evoker, specs being buffed, or the more relevant, for example, Fire Mage being nerfed or Windwalker being nerfed, etc., to try to then compare them with their current results and how things have been going right now in the progress run of the raid. We said, of course, when we were expecting the balance tuning to land, that the balance tuning was going to be slightly more raid focused than it was going to be Mythic Plus focused, likely more changes focused around Mythic Plus will be maybe in a couple of weeks perhaps, but of course with the race to world first starting and many players still being busy raiding, that's where the attention was going to be, right? So starting with, let's just go with the hard impact picture of the current situation of the results in the raid, which looks like this. So before we go onto this, last time we looked at this very early on, we practically had barely any logs of sticks because it turned out to be quite the difficult boss who had to be mega nerfed. Now we have more logs of sticks. We are still not talking about, a plethora of logs for sticks. Beyond the sticks, we start having, a few sprocket logs, which again, how many guilds is it going to be? Like 30 guilds maybe, having them log public for Sprocket. And then after Sprocket, you start having practically just like 3 guilds maybe logging the results of 1 hour band. So basically we have relevant results for the first 4 bosses and some more, but a few for Sprocket in terms of all of these results. Now, it's also worth pointing out, for those who don't know, that Outlaw has been bugged for a while, so quite a few of these results have been, tainted by the coup de grace trickster bug that is currently going on for Outlaw, having to do very simply with Outlaw's CDR being so fast, so quick, you can practically double hit coup de grace, basically have it happen twice, and this is very relevant because coup de grace gives you 5 stacks of flawless form. Flawless form specifically mentions multiple applications can overlap, and because you can double hit this, you're gonna get 10 stacks of flawless form, giving you 30% more finisher damage. You can see here the stacks of coup de grace going very often upwards of close to 10 stacks of your unseen form buff, which is likely higher than it was supposed to be. That's partially the reason for these good results for Outlaw. Besides Outlaw, though, you do have, of course, Fire Mage and Windwalker. That is why it's relevant to mention them, because they are the 2 ones being nerfed this reset. 3% flat nerf for Fire and then 4% flat nerf for Windwalker. Now, some Windwalkers already went ahead with their plans and started to preemptively run Slicing Winds anyways, because that's what's gonna happen after the 4% nerf. With Slicing Winds being buffed by 20%, you can move over to Slicing Winds and turn that 4% nerf into like a sub 2% nerf to make it smaller. That's the change for Windwalker. So neither of these 2 results is bound to be surpassed by any other spec anyways, even after the nerfs. We can definitely spend a bit more about the other part of the nerfs, which is the 1-2 healers, and these are also the 2 healers being nerfed, Discipline and Mistweaver Monk. Now, I have my theory of why this looks like this. Number 1, there are way more flavor of the month rerolls of Mistweaver than there are Discipline. Look at this, Discipline is even still losing to Resto Shaman because there are still so many 1-trick Holy Priests that refuse to play Discipline. And number 2, Mistweaver Monk is much easier to play. So it's much easier to move into Mistweaver and also have much worse results than your spec would be able to have. The other argument about this is the fact that the early bosses are not particularly amazing for Mistweaver. Mistweaver has better times practically after you start going into bosses that are not being logged quite yet, like Sprocket, One Arm Bandit, and also especially Magzi where many guilds are already prepping their triple Mistweaver Monk for this fight, although it's not really just for their healing, actually. But yeah, it looks better than this, okay? It's not that Mistweaver is being nerfed by some 2-ish%, while technically, if you think about it, they are somewhat the same as Resto Shaman. No, they are not. They are better, and the nerf was warranted, just like the nerf to Discipline Priest. We can't say there is much of any surprise here when talking about the nerf. Now, one nerf we haven't touched on, mostly because we also said it was somewhat confusing, was the one to Shadow Priest, which was the tiny-ish 3% nerf to the spec. You know, it was confusing because, of course, up to this point in these results, Shadow Priest does have some decent room to do decent damage, because on Vexy you have a bunch of adds you can multi-dot and cleave on them. On Cauldron, you can somewhat, just like the Warlocks, cheese by multi-dotting them, even though there is just a couple of them in terms of targets. And Rick is also another fight with a bunch of adds you can cleave. What is perhaps a bit more surprising is that Styx is where Shadow Priest does horribly, despite also being quite the ad-heavy fight. To be fair, the adds have been nerfed so much, especially the bombshells. Maybe they just don't have the time to do well in terms of multi-dotting and then spreading their damage nearly as well. However, things are about to get worse. Because Sprocket is a pure single target fight where you won't expect to see Shadow Priest doing excessively well, things are about to get much better on One Arm Bandit, where Shadow Priest is one of the highlight performers in the entire fight, to the point where multiple guilds were stacking 3 or even 4 of them to get rid of the adds, and then things will get somewhat worse on Magzi and Galdewing. So the 3% nerfs, you know, was somewhat perhaps unwarranted for Shadow. Now, as for the buffs, we had the question mark of the buffs given to Elemental and the buffs given to Balance. Why? Well, because while we are also talking about the raid, we're also talking about Mythic Plus, and Elemental and Balance were doing very well, in particular Balance. So you had this question about, okay, but why does this needs to be buffed? Why does this needs to be buffed? You know, I can understand if this gets nerfed, sure, makes sense. And this gets nerfed, of course, no problem. However, why are these two literally sandwiching the two nerfed spec getting buffed? That makes no sense. Well, the current situation for Elemental is that, of course, in the raid, they are supposed most of the time to be playing single target, which is why in Mythic Plus they play Stormbringer, the AoE build of choice, and in the raid they move over to Farseer. When you move over from Elemental to Balanced Druid, you have a very similar scenario, where in Mythic Plus they are playing Eluna's Chosen, and then they go into the raid and they are playing Keeper of the Grove. This is a large TLDR to say Balance and Elemental were doing great in AoE but poorly in single target. And their single target and AoE were very well defined and decided and split by their hero talents. In this case, for example, Keeper of the Grove is the beneficiary of one of the buffs of Balance, like Wrath being buffed by 30%, right? Why is this relevant for Keeper? Because on Keeper, in a single target fight, you do cast Wrath 88 times. It is your most casted spell. It is your solar eclipse, which is where you will be spending most of your time in. So buffing this by 30% is quite relevant in a single target fight or in a raid fight. Meanwhile, if you're playing Eluna's Chosen in Mythic Plus, you look at Balanced Druid, you look at Wrath, and while it looks like you have tons of casts of Wrath, those are nowhere near the casts of your Starfire, and they are also mostly just to generate your Lunar Eclipse, not really for the damage. After all, a single cast of Starfire does 3 million damage, and a single cast of Wrath does 220k. Yes, it's a bit unfair. This is just padding AoE if we actually move to a pure single target boss, which this is all moon runes, but I'm assuming the third boss is gonna be single target, right? On a single target boss, you can see that Wrath is doing 206 and Starfire is doing 966. It is still far superior. So buffing Wrath is still good for single target, but not for AoE. Shaman gets a similar treatment in having all of their single target abilities, the generators, being buffed. So Lightning Bolt, Lava Burst, Frost Shock, Ice Fury, and then you look at Mythic Plus, you look at the damage profile of an Elemental Shaman in Mythic Plus, and you will see that, you know, Lava Burst and Lightning Bolt and Ice Fury combined are about 14% of their damage. So in AoE, we are talking about a 1.1% buff. You know, in Mythic Plus, it's like a 1% buff for Elemental. It's a bigger buff in single target, right? Which will not have this type of damage profile. For single target, you have to move over to the raid. Let's look at a proper single target fight. Lock and stock. So of course, single target, well, that's expected. Doing terribly in single target. That's why you get Lava Burst and Lightning Bolt buffed by 8% for your single target performance. So that's the reasoning why buffing these two specs, because they're doing poorly in the raid, while still doing fine in Mythic Plus, and also why we said the buffs and the nerfs were going to be more focused on the raid performance, and why these two are specs being buffed. Talking about, since we are, again, they are sandwiching someone else, this time they are sandwiching specs being buffed as well, because Frost Mage is also one of the specs being buffed by 4%, and Arcane is also going to be buffed by 8%. Also Demo will be buffed by 3%, and Frost Decay will also be buffed by 3%. You also have Devastation Evoker being buffed by some 4-ish% in this upcoming reset. So most of these specs leaning towards the bottom half are getting somewhere between a 3 to 4% damage buff to bring them closer to this bunch of specs. So those are the planned changes in terms of buffs. Now, in terms of performance, again, it's worth remembering that much of this is still hinging on the results on the first 4 bosses. So the damage profile on these first bosses is relevant to how these specs are performing, because, you know, add cleave fight, many adds fight. So there's a lot of prominence here on doing add damage, some flavor of add damage. You know, Sprocket will be absolutely pure single target. Maxi will be mostly single target. You don't really damage the bombs, and the adds that spawn die quite quickly, and even the goons that spawn, they are locked in a cage where, unless you are cheesing like a fire mage spreading your ignites, most of the time they will be just single target damage. So we are bound in the next few bosses to see much more value in terms of single target damage, and even one-arm bandit, while being a treasure of performance, particularly for these two specs right here. For most of the other specs, especially for the majority of the melees, will mostly be a 1 to 2 target cleave fight. When you move the boss on top of one of the adds, you're gonna have, as a melee player, you're gonna have basically just 2 targets at best to do damage to, right? So the damage profile of the last 4 will change quite a bit from the first 4. There will be more focus on single target, more focus on pure single target. So if we go back here, for example, and we looked at the damage to bosses, you'll see some changes. Arms, for example, is first. And then you have Havoc, much higher up. You have Unholy, much higher up, which is much different than the overall damage that we see here, right? Arms, for example, is towards the bottom. Unholy is in the middle. So there are quite some changes, and these specs will gain more value in these later bosses. So we can hope for an evening out of the gaps of these specs right now, even though perhaps, actually, no joke, what will change more the results next week won't even be the buffs and nerfs. It will just be the more bosses being logged later on than what we currently have. Besides the ones actually being nerfed, who will simply flat out lose their performance, many others will change based on more and more logs of more and more bosses being defeated. The last bit for buffs didn't just go to the DPS, it also went to the healers. As we mentioned, these 2 are nerfed, but also these 3 are buffed. Preservation is getting a flat 5% healing buff, plus some minor buff heal to Spirit Bloom. You also have the buff to Holy Priest that nears 7% healing, and then over 8% healing done to Holy Paladin. So all of these should be going quite further up. You know, right now Preservation is at 2.163 million average HPS, increased by some 6-ish%, should be nearing the 2.3. Actually very close to Resto Shaman, for example. Same goes for these 2 other specs, you know. Holy Priest with this average HPS, buffed by 6%, should go to 2,250,000, which is about 40k below this Resto Shaman line. And lastly, Holy Paladin, practically almost the exact same median as Holy Priest, buffed by 9%, 8 to 9% should break the 2.3 million. So they should actually go at this line. So with these buffs, actually all of these 3 specs could be expected to reach this average line right here. So they should now be way more relevant of an option. Not that it's gonna change much this composition, running rampant, even actually the extra one of Resto Shaman, to be fair, being amongst the most popular picks right now. That is not really gonna change, these 3 being left for dead. But you know, for later on in the tier, and also for, so to speak, slower guilds, it will make it much more bearable to run these healers as well, and not being nearly as overshadowed as the top picks right now for healers, specifically of course in the raid. That is the current situation we have right now in terms of the performance and as well as the popularity of the specs in the raid. No surprises, many of these continue to be super popular, like BM or even Ret, and the classics, you know, the classics of specs like Feral being very unpopular, Survival being very unpopular, and finally, it's so good to see Augmentation being dead. Augmentation has been buffed as well by roughly 5% overall, which is obviously not gonna do anything, luckily. I wanted to close the current overall average results in the raid for this week 3 of the tier to laugh at some people, and we are specifically laughing at people who die a lot, and these are the results of the people we can laugh to. First of all, let's exclude this cheater right here. As you know, I pointed this out before the tier, Restitution is an OP talent now that it's only in the very early bracket of your talents, giving you a cheat death. So every time you die as a Holy Priest, you won't count as dying. Also, doubly better, this can also cheat wipes, because if the Holy Priest is the last one to die, he will stay in Guardian Spirit form as the boss resets. And being in Guardian Spirit form doesn't count you as dead, so you will not go down as a death in your log if you reset the boss, if the boss resets as you are still in spirit form. So this is a complete cheat, a fraud. But besides Holy Priest, you do have some specs to laugh at. For example, BM. The most played spec, of course, is also the one that dies the most. You have Devastation also, very easy to get killed, 30% of chance of dying in every pool, whether it is an actual kill or a wipe. Almost 1 in 3 times, one of the Dev Evokers will be dead. Same goes for another traditionally squishy spec like Balance Druid, quite often dying. And then a testament, perhaps, to the fraudulency that are mages. Despite all of their defensiveness, despite all of their utility in mobility and moving around and staying alive, they still continue to be one of the deathest specs. We also have some other confirmations, the confirmations that DKs are extremely tanky, and remember, this tier they nerfed DK's tankiness. They are still very, very sturdy. Healers, you have Resto Shaman being quite tanky, or maybe Resto Shaman players are just better than the other healers. Same goes for Mistweaver and Resto Druid. Very tanky, very reliable, and then, you know, Discipline is quite high up on the squishiness chart as the deathiest of the healers. It's also interesting how Resto Shaman dies so much less than Elemental, and so much less than Enhancement. Despite having practically the exact same defensive tools, you have the passive buff of being a healer, of always being able to heal yourself first, so you can kind of cheat in that sense. But these are just to finish the current death ratios of specs right now in Mythic raid, of course. So with this, we can close now our overall review of week 3 of raid progression, both from a standpoint of the current throughput and performance of specs, as well as, why not, their survival rates in the raid, both not just for DPS but for healers as well. Again, with an asterisk, well, actually 2 asterisks. Asterisk number 1, most of these results are for the first 4 bosses, which means they are going to be based on the damage profile for these 4 bosses, which, as we said, is quite different than the bottom 4. And then lastly, that this is also with the balance tuning in mind that is about to come. So, taking in mind these 2 specs being buffed, this and this being buffed, these 2 being nerfed, and this one as well, why not, be nerfed. So that is also what we can expect in basically a day or 2, once the beginning of the 4th reset will come for patch 11.1. But for today, on this Monday, it is now time to say goodbye to each other, because I have to go and eat dinner for today. So Thanks of course everyone for having watched the video, together with of course everyone else who's been supporting completely for free, as well as liking and commenting down below, together with of course subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you again for watching, see you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, yeah, we are cutting it a bit late. This was supposed to be done about 3 hours ago, and I went in a trance where I just AFK'd my brain for 3 hours doing nothing. Still, better late than never.